They told you Red Bull won because they were faster, because they were smarter, because they were inevitable. That's not the whole story. What if I told you the most powerful team in Formula One was built on pressure no camera ever captured? Behind the dominance, there were closed doors, hard decisions, and a culture where survival mattered more than comfort. Drivers who knew one bad weekend could change everything. Engineers who worked in silence, afraid of becoming the next name erased from the wall. This wasn't just a team racing others on track. This was a team constantly testing its own limits. Because at Red Bull, winning wasn't enough. You had to prove you deserved to stay. Netflix showed you the trophies, the celebrations, the smiles. What they didn't show was the cost. This is the Formula One story Netflix was too afraid to tell. And once you see it, you'll never look at Red Bull the same way again. There are teams that enter Formula One asking for respect. And then there are teams that enter Formula One assuming they won't get it, and deciding they don't care. Red Bull was never meant to fit in. When the brand first appeared in the paddock, it didn't arrive with reverence for history. It arrived with impatience, with a different language, with an energy that felt almost offensive to the old guard of Formula One. This wasn't a company born from racing heritage. It was born from marketing, from risk, from spectacle. And that alone made people uncomfortable. Because Formula One is built on tradition. Red Bull was built on disruption. In 2005, when Red Bull purchased the remains of the Jaguar F1 team, the operation they inherited was broken, financially, structurally, emotionally. Morale was low. Expectations were lower. Jaguar had become a symbol of wasted potential. Most companies would have tried to fix it quietly. Red Bull didn't. They painted the cars aggressively. They changed the atmosphere overnight. They brought music, energy, and a sense that Formula One didn't quite know what to do with them. And inside the paddock, people whispered the same question. How long will this last? But what most people didn't see was that behind the loud image was a very deliberate plan. Dietrich Mateschitz didn't buy a Formula One team for fun. He bought it because he believed the sport had grown predictable, and predictability was the enemy of relevance. He didn't want Red Bull to participate. He wanted it to matter. From the very beginning, the message inside the team was clear. This was not a long-term experiment. This was a takeover attempt. And that pressure to justify the investment, to justify the noise, to justify the disruption, became the foundation of Red Bull's internal culture. There was no grace period, no slow build. Performance was expected immediately. That expectation filtered down into every layer of the team. Engineers understood quickly that this was not a place to hide. Drivers understood that talent alone wouldn't save them. Management understood that failure would be very public. Because Red Bull didn't do quiet losses. The early seasons were chaotic. Mistakes were made. Decisions were rushed. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Red Bull was learning the political language of Formula One fast. They watched how power really worked, who influenced regulations, who controlled narratives, who survived mistakes, and they adapted. One of the most underestimated moves Red Bull made during those years wasn't technical. It was cultural. They refused to behave like a traditional team. While others leaned on hierarchy and history, Red Bull leaned on speed, not just on track, but in decision-making. If something wasn't working, it was replaced. If someone wasn't delivering, they were questioned. And that approach created results, but it also created fear. Because when change happens quickly, stability disappears. Inside the garage, people felt it. The sense that you were always being evaluated, always being measured against an invisible standard that shifted week to week. There were no villains, no dramatic betrayals, just a quiet understanding that this was a place where comfort was dangerous. And then came the people who would define the team's identity. Christian Horner arrived as one of the youngest team principals in Formula One history. Young, ambitious, and instantly underestimated. Many in the paddock didn't take him seriously. That was a mistake. Horner understood something fundamental about Red Bull. This team didn't need permission to exist. It needed results. And standing beside him, often in silence, was a figure who would become both feared and respected across the grid: Helmut Marko. Marko wasn't there to make friends. He was there to enforce standards. And those standards were unforgiving. The combination was explosive. A young team principal learning the political game. A ruthless talent evaluator deciding who belonged and who didn't. And an owner who expected boldness, not caution. This was not a democracy. It was a performance-driven ecosystem. And ecosystems like that don't just produce winners. They produce pressure. By the late 2000s, Red Bull was no longer seen as a joke. It was no longer a novelty. It was a threat. And threats attract attention. Rival teams started watching Red Bull more closely, questioning their methods, their spending, their influence. Inside Red Bull, this scrutiny only reinforced the mindset. If everyone is watching you, you can't afford weakness. And that belief became embedded in the team's DNA. Young drivers were brought in early, given opportunity quickly, and removed just as quickly. Not because Red Bull lacked loyalty, but because loyalty was conditional. Conditional on results. This wasn't cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was survival logic. Because in Formula One, relevance is fragile. And Red Bull had no intention of becoming irrelevant. By the time success finally arrived, real success, it didn't feel sudden inside the team. It felt earned. But it also felt expensive. Because every victory had been paid for with pressure. Every step forward came with someone being left behind. And that reality would only intensify. Because Red Bull was no longer chasing respect. It had it. And the cost of maintaining it would be even higher. What began as disruption was about to become domination. And domination in Formula One reveals everything. Power in Formula One doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, behind closed doors, disguised as confidence. By the late 2000s, Red Bull had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer the loud newcomers trying to be taken seriously. They were becoming a force others had to account for. And that shift changed everything. Inside the paddock, attitudes hardened. Meetings felt colder. Conversations became more careful. Because Red Bull didn't behave like teams were supposed to behave. They questioned decisions openly. They challenged rules aggressively. They pushed for interpretations that benefited them and didn't apologize for it. Some called it arrogance. Others called it ambition. Inside Red Bull, it was simply strategy. Christian Horner learned quickly that influence in Formula One wasn't earned only by winning races. It was earned by presence, by speaking up, by never looking uncertain, even when the answers weren't clear yet. He became sharper in meetings, more assertive with the FIA, more visible in moments where silence used to be the safer choice. And that visibility made him a target. Rival team principals began watching Red Bull differently, not as competitors, but as disruptors who didn't respect unwritten rules. Because Formula One has two rulebooks, the official one, and the one everyone pretends doesn't exist. Red Bull learned the second one faster than most. Behind the scenes, alliances formed quietly. Engine suppliers became leverage. Young driver contracts became bargaining chips. Red Bull wasn't just building cars anymore. They were building influence. And influence comes with friction. Helmut Marko's role expanded during this period. He became the enforcer of standards not just for drivers, but for the team's identity. If you fit the Red Bull philosophy, you were protected. If you didn't, you were exposed. That clarity terrified some, and energized others. Young drivers knew exactly where they stood. There was no ambiguity. Deliver or disappear. And while the public saw opportunity, those inside the system felt something else. Pressure. Because the Red Bull Junior program wasn't a safety net. It was a filter. Only the strongest made it through. The rest vanished quietly. And this ruthless efficiency sent a message to the paddock. Red Bull was willing to do what others wouldn't. That willingness extended beyond drivers. Engine partnerships became political weapons. Public statements were carefully timed. Private frustrations were occasionally aired just loudly enough to be heard. This wasn't recklessness. It was calculated discomfort. Red Bull understood that being liked was irrelevant. Being feared, even slightly, was useful. But power always attracts resistance. Other teams began questioning Red Bull's methods more openly. Were they bending rules? Were they pushing boundaries too far? Nothing illegal was ever proven. But suspicion itself became part of the battlefield. And suspicion changes behavior. Inside Red Bull, this external pressure reinforced an internal belief. Trust no one completely. Information became controlled. Access became selective. Even success was managed carefully, because dominance hadn't arrived yet. And Red Bull knew that true power in Formula One only comes once you start winning. Until then, everything is provisional. The team was improving rapidly. Results were coming. Podiums became frequent. But championships still felt just out of reach. And that gap between promise and fulfillment was dangerous. Because expectations inside Red Bull were rising faster than results. Engineers felt it. Designers felt it. Drivers felt it. Mistakes that once would have been tolerated were now scrutinized. Second place began to feel like failure. And when ambition outpaces reality, tension fills the space. Meetings became sharper. Debriefs grew longer. Voices were raised, not often but meaningfully. No one panicked. But no one relaxed either. Because Red Bull had built momentum. And momentum in Formula One demands payoff. By the end of this phase, Red Bull wasn't asking if they could win championships. They were asking when. And that question carried consequences. Because once you expect dominance, everything else feels unacceptable. And that expectation would soon collide with human limits. What Red Bull built in influence and ambition was about to be tested, not by rivals alone, but by the people inside the garage. Because power, once claimed, always demands proof. And the next chapter would decide whether Red Bull was a temporary disruption, or something far more dangerous. By the time Red Bull started winning races consistently, something else had already been established inside the team. A rule no one ever needed to write down. At Red Bull, opportunity was generous. But forgiveness was rare. The outside world saw a miracle factory. Young drivers given chances earlier than anyone else. Seats offered before careers had even fully begun. Inside the system, it felt very different. Because every opportunity came with a clock. And that clock was always ticking. The Red Bull Junior program became legendary almost overnight. It was talked about as a dream path, a fast track to Formula One. But what most people didn't understand was that it wasn't designed to protect drivers. It was designed to test them, relentlessly. Drivers were promoted aggressively, sometimes before they were ready, not out of recklessness but belief. Belief that true talent reveals itself under pressure. And if it didn't, the system moved on. There were no dramatic firings. No emotional goodbyes. Contracts ended. Phone calls were made. Seats changed hands. And the paddock learned an uncomfortable truth. Red Bull did not wait. This wasn't cruelty. It was philosophy. Helmut Marko believed pressure didn't destroy drivers. It exposed them. And Red Bull built an ecosystem where exposure was unavoidable. Some thrived. Others disappeared. Inside the garages, drivers understood exactly what was at stake every weekend. Not just points. Not just results. Relevance. A bad run of races didn't just hurt confidence, it invited doubt. And doubt at Red Bull was dangerous. Because once doubt entered the conversation, decisions followed quickly. The team never denied this culture. They simply didn't apologize for it. From their perspective, Formula One was too ruthless to pretend otherwise. Why protect someone who couldn't survive the pressure? That logic made sense until it didn't. Because pressure doesn't only affect drivers. Engineers felt it too. Design teams knew that one failed concept could shift internal trust. Strategy calls were debated harder than ever. Mistakes lingered longer than before. No one wanted to be the weak link. And when everyone fears being the weak link, communication changes. People speak less. Second-guess more. Risk becomes heavier. Ironically, in a team built on boldness, fear began to creep in. Not panic, control. Drivers stopped asking questions publicly. Concerns were raised quietly, if at all, because survival required alignment, and alignment required silence. From the outside, Red Bull looked unified. Inside, it was efficient but tense. This culture produced results. No one could deny that, but it also produced casualties. Careers stalled, confidence shattered, talents questioned their own worth. And yet, drivers kept coming, because Red Bull offered something no other team could promise. A real chance. A fast one. And that promise was powerful enough to override fear. By the time Red Bull reached the brink of total dominance, the system was fully formed. It rewarded those who adapted, consumed those who didn't, and it did so without hesitation. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. A structure that believed Formula One didn't need comfort. It needed clarity. But clarity has a price. And as Red Bull prepared to enter its most successful era, one question lingered quietly beneath the victories. How long can a system built on constant pressure hold together? Because dominance doesn't remove stress, concentrates it. And soon, Red Bull would discover that the most dangerous moment for any team is not when it's chasing success. It's when it finally has it. And that realization would come faster and harder than anyone expected. Winning was supposed to bring relief. That's what most teams believe. But when Red Bull finally crossed that final line, from contender to champion, something unexpected happened. The pressure didn't disappear. It multiplied. The first championship didn't calm the team. It validated everything they had built. And validation is dangerous, because once you prove your philosophy works, you become trapped by it. Sebastian Vettel arrived at the center of that moment. Young, precise, relentless, a driver perfectly aligned with Red Bull's system. He didn't fight the structure. He absorbed it, and that made him unstoppable. Titles followed. Records fell. Red Bull became the reference point of Formula One. From the outside, it looked effortless. Inside the garage, it was anything but. Dominance changes relationships. When a team is chasing, unity is easy. When a team is winning, hierarchy becomes visible. Decisions that once felt collective now felt directional. Support became selective. Trust became conditional. Not because of malice, but because success demands clarity. And clarity creates winners and losers. As Red Bull kept winning, expectations hardened into demands. Second place was no longer acceptable. Mistakes were no longer learning moments. They were threats. The garage grew quieter. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything mattered more. And then came the moment that would expose everything. Multi 21. To the public, it was a simple breach of team orders. A line crossed in the heat of competition. Inside Red Bull, it was something else entirely. It was the collision of philosophy and emotion. The system said control. The driver said instinct. Vettel didn't see himself as breaking rules. He saw himself as doing what champions do, winning. And Red Bull was forced to confront a truth it had avoided for years. You can't build a culture that rewards aggression, and then be surprised when aggression wins. Behind closed doors, conversations became sharper. Not explosive, but surgical. Trust was questioned. Authority reasserted. Lines were redrawn. Mark Webber felt it immediately, not because the team hated him, but because alignment had shifted. In a system built on performance, narrative matters. And the narrative was moving away from him. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't conspiracy. It was inevitability, because dominance requires a face. And Red Bull had chosen theirs. But that choice came with consequences. The garage split subtly. Not into sides, but into silences. People stopped saying certain things out loud. Drivers stopped expecting fairness to feel equal. Because equal treatment is rare in winning teams. What matters is effectiveness. And Red Bull was ruthlessly effective. Championship after championship followed. And with each one, the cost rose. Vettel carried the weight of being perfect. The team carried the weight of being expected to be perfect. And perfection is exhausting. The paddock began pushing back. Questions grew louder. Rules tightened. And for the first time since Red Bull's rise, cracks appeared. Not in speed but in balance. When the regulations changed, Red Bull's dominance didn't vanish overnight. But the certainty did. And certainty was the foundation of everything they had built. Inside the team, something shifted. The same system that had fueled dominance now demanded adaptation. And adaptation required humility. That didn't come easily. Because teams that win this much rarely believe they should change. And Red Bull was no exception. As the Vettel era reached its limits, the tension wasn't explosive. It was heavy. A sense that the formula needed renewal, but no one wanted to admit it first. And that hesitation would cost them. Because Formula One doesn't wait. The moment dominance ends, the reckoning begins. And Red Bull was about to learn that staying on top can be harder and more dangerous than getting there. By the time Red Bull entered the new era of Formula One, something fundamental had changed. Not just the rules, not just the engines. The certainty was gone. The turbohybrid era arrived like a shockwave, and suddenly Red Bull, the team that had mastered control, found itself dependent. Dependent on power units. Dependent on external timelines. Dependent on promises that weren't always kept. For the first time in years, Red Bull could no longer solve every problem internally. And that terrified them. The cars were no longer weapons of dominance. They were compromises. Races that once felt inevitable now felt defensive. Victories became rare. Podiums felt fragile. Inside the garage, the tone changed. No more quiet confidence. No more calm inevitability. Instead, there were questions. And Red Bull had never been comfortable with questions. Engine reliability became a weekly anxiety. Grid penalties stacked up. Radio messages carried frustration that could no longer be masked. Drivers pushed harder, sometimes too hard, trying to compensate for what the car lacked. And when effort replaces confidence, mistakes follow. Sebastian Vettel felt it more than anyone. He had been shaped by a system that thrived on precision and predictability. Now, nothing was predictable. The car moved differently. The power delivery felt alien. The edge he once had no longer responded the same way. And inside Red Bull, loyalty was being tested. Not emotionally, structurally. Because when results fade, narratives shift. Questions that were once unthinkable became routine. Is the driver still the reference? Is the system outdated? Is the philosophy still valid? These questions weren't asked publicly, but they were felt everywhere. Meetings became longer, debates sharper, blame more carefully worded. No one wanted to say it out loud, but Red Bull was afraid. Afraid of becoming just another team. Afraid that their era had been exposed as regulation-dependent. Afraid that the machine they built was too rigid to adapt. The Paddock sensed it. Rivals smelled vulnerability. And when vulnerability appears in Formula One, it is attacked immediately. Red Bull responded the only way it knew how. Pressure increased. Drivers were expected to extract miracles. Engineers were pushed beyond limits. Public statements remained confident, almost defiant. But confidence without results is fragile. And the cracks widened. Vettel began looking elsewhere. Not out of betrayal but survival. Because champions understand something early. Loyalty is powerful. Until it costs you your future. When Vettel's departure became inevitable, it wasn't dramatic. It was heavy. The team didn't explode. It hollowed. A core piece of the empire was gone. And suddenly, Red Bull had to confront the most dangerous phase of any dynasty. The transition. Who were they without Vettel? Could the system still function without its perfect product? Was the philosophy adaptable or obsolete? Young drivers rotated through seats at alarming speed. Expectations remained sky-high. Patience did not increase. The junior program intensified. Pressure returned to its purest form. Because Red Bull believed the answer to instability wasn't softness. It was selection. Again. But this time something was different. The sport had evolved. Drivers were smarter. Media exposure harsher. Mental resilience mattered more than ever. And Red Bull's approach, once revolutionary, was now being questioned. Not just by outsiders, but internally. Could they rebuild dominance without breaking people? Or was breaking people the point? As the seasons passed, Red Bull hovered in a dangerous space. Not weak, but not feared. And in Formula One, that space is lethal, because it invites doubt, and doubt invites change. Somewhere inside Red Bull, a realization began to form. Slowly, reluctantly, the empire couldn't return the same way it had risen. It needed something new, someone new, a driver not shaped by the old era but forged in chaos. And when that driver finally arrived, Red Bull wouldn't just rebuild. They would redefine everything. Red Bull didn't rebuild quietly. They never have. They rebuilt the only way they knew how, by accelerating into uncertainty. When Max Verstappen arrived, he didn't fit the mold. He shattered it. Too young, too aggressive, too raw. From the outside, it looked reckless. From the inside, it felt inevitable. Red Bull didn't see a risk. They saw a mirror. Max was everything their philosophy believed in: unfiltered, fearless, unapologetic. A driver who didn't ask permission. A driver who didn't wait for comfort. And most importantly, a driver who thrived when others hesitated. The pressure that crushed some drivers didn't bend him. It sharpened him. From the very first races, it was clear this wasn't a development project. This was a takeover in slow motion. Mistakes happened, publicly, painfully. Crashes, penalties, headlines. But Red Bull didn't flinch, because they recognized something familiar. Not perfection, hunger. Inside the garage, the culture shifted again. Not softer, not calmer, sharper. Everything now revolved around extracting maximum potential instantly. Learning curves were compressed. Patience was minimal. And Max absorbed it all. He didn't resist the pressure. He weaponized it. As the seasons passed, the tension between speed and control became Red Bull's defining battle. Max pushed limits faster than the team could sometimes manage. The team tried to contain chaos without killing instinct. It wasn't always clean. There were clashes, radio messages that felt raw, moments when authority was tested. But unlike before, Red Bull didn't try to suppress it. They leaned into it, because they understood something now that they hadn't before. You don't tame a force like this. You aim it. When the regulations shifted again, Red Bull was ready. Not because they predicted everything, but because they had built flexibility into their identity. The system evolved. Not kinder, smarter. And when the car finally matched the driver, the result wasn't dominance. It was inevitability. Wins stacked up. Records fell again. But this time it felt different. This wasn't a team executing perfection. This was a team embracing controlled aggression. The Paddock felt it. Rivals didn't just fear Red Bull's speed. They feared their conviction. Because Red Bull no longer chased approval. They chased clarity. Max became more than a champion. He became a symbol of what Red Bull had always been trying to prove. That Formula One doesn't reward balance. It rewards belief. Belief pushed to its limits. But belief has consequences. As dominance returned, the questions returned too. Is this sustainable? Is this fair? Is this too much? Red Bull didn't answer. They never do. Because their story has never been about comfort. It's been about pressure applied, endured, mastered. From an energy drink brand dismissed as a joke, to an empire rebuilt twice in the most unforgiving sport on earth. Not by copying others, but by refusing to apologize for who they are. And that's the truth Netflix never tells you. Formula One isn't driven by machines. It's driven by people willing to live inside pressure and dare it to break them first. Red Bull didn't just survive Formula One. They forced it to adapt. And as long as pressure exists, someone like Red Bull will always find a way to turn it into power.